Hi everyone, my name is Philip and today I'm going to talk to you about the Sofar Solar HYD ES grid-tied hybrid inverters. I have one of these solar inverters installed at my home and it works great. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the technical details relating to rates of charging and discharging that will help guide you in selecting which model to use. These solar inverters are single phase and designed to work in homes. They range from 3,000 watts to 6,000 watts of output power. Before we start, let's talk about the difference between a grid-tied inverter and a hybrid grid-tied inverter. A grid-tied inverter requires a grid connection to your home to work. Any excess solar power it generates is fed back into the grid. If your home uses more power than what the solar can provide, the excess comes from the grid. One important thing to note is that if there's a power cut, a grid-tied inverter is required to shut down. So during a power cut, you'll have no power at home. This is a regulated requirement so that if someone is working on the grid and shut it down on purpose, your home doesn't liven it back up again. A hybrid grid-tied inverter is the same, except that it has a battery attached. Any excess power generated can be stored in the battery for later use. They also have an emergency power supply output that will keep running during a power cut. What do the inverter specifications mean? You'll notice most of the specifications are the same for all the units. The inverter rating refers to the maximum power output for the connection to the grid from solar and battery. That doesn't mean each individual energy source can supply this though. The maximum battery discharge rate is 70 amps. For a 48 volt battery system, this is 3,360 watts. Let's consider an example. Let's say you had the HYD 6000 ES, which has a rating of 6,000 watts. On the standard grid output of the inverter, this means if it was nighttime and there was no solar generation, and you had a load of 4,360 watts, a maximum of 3,360 would come from the battery, and the rest would have to come from the grid. The 6,000 watt rating is the total combined output, but you won't be able to achieve this operating from battery only. There is also an emergency power supply connection called the EPS connection. It has a maximum output rating of 3,000 watts. This could come exclusively from battery or from solar and battery. You can regard VA and W numbers as the same for most homes, as they will have a power factor near 1. The maximum battery charging rate is 60 amps. For a 48 volt battery system, this equates to 2,880 watts. If you have surplus solar power above this, it can't be used to speed battery charging. It can only be exported to the grid. If you had a 5 kilowatt hour battery, the minimum charge time would be 104 minutes, which is about 1 hour and 44 minutes. If you had a 10 kilowatt hour battery, the minimum charge time would be 208 minutes, which is around 3 hours and 28 minutes. If you are planning on having 3,000 watts of usable solar power from solar panels for 6 hours a day, you aren't going to have much left for other things. Half the day would be spent charging the 10 kilowatt hour battery. Let's take an example. Let's say you had a 10 kilowatt hour battery and you wanted to allow for your solar panels to produce 75% of their rated capacity on average across 6 hours of sunlight, and you wanted to allow for an average of 3,000 watts for your home use on top of the battery charging. Your peak load would be 2,880 watts for battery charging, plus 3,000 watts for your home, which would be 5,880 watts. Then divide by 0.75 to allow for 75% of the solar panel's rated capacity on average across the whole day, and you get 7,840 watts of solar panels required. If you went with less than this, you would risk never having sufficient surplus solar power to fully charge your battery. The 5,880 watts also tells us the model of inverter we need. The 5,000 model would be too small. We wouldn't be able to reach our generation target. It has a maximum solar input power rating of 5,500 watts. We would have to use the 6,000 model. Note that you can have a larger amount of solar generation capacity. In this case, 7,840 watts can be connected to the inverter to allow for the solar panels not generating at 100% the whole day, but you can't exceed the maximum PV voltage or current rating listed in the inverter specifications. So you need to check the specifications on the solar panels you plan to use to keep the quantity of panels within the inverter specifications. You'll also need to consider if you have sufficient roof space to fit the solar panels to be able to generate the power you need. In summary, when choosing which size inverter to use, you'll also need to give some consideration to how much load you want to allow for, as well as the size of the battery pack to allow for sufficient time to charge the battery. As a guide, my reading of the specifications suggests you want the same or more solar generation than battery capacity. So if you wanted 5,000 watt hours of battery storage, you'll want a minimum of 5,000 watts of solar generation capacity. And then to choose the model of the inverter, if you want to minimize grid use, you will need to add the size of the average load you want to allow for, like 2,000 watts, to the battery charging rate, which was 2,880 watts. In this example, it would be 4,880 watts, so the 5,000 ES would be a good fit. I hope this has given you some food for thought on what size model you need to choose.